So what if the story we've kind of told ourselves about the Stone Age, about violence? What if it was missing something pretty startling?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, the picture was survival against nature, maybe some squabbles,
Yeah.
sure, but not really. Like organized group conflict.
Exactly. But now there's this skeleton, right,
Yeah.
found years ago in Italy.
And it's completely changing that narrative, all thanks to some really incredible new science.
This individual, they call him Tagliente 1,
Mm-hmm.
and he might be giving us the earliest solid evidence we have for, well, strategic violence between groups, planned violence.
It's pretty compelling stuff. So today we're doing deep dive into that, looking at what this cutting-edge science showed about his death.
And what it tells us about life and conflict way back 17,000 years ago.
Yeah, we're drawing mainly on a new research paper in Scientific Reports and also an article that discusses those findings.
Okay, so settle in. You're about to see the Paleolithic world from a very different angle, maybe a bit startling. Right, let's start with Tagliente 1 himself. Who was this person? Where does he fit in?
Okay, so Tagliente 1, he was a young man. The estimate is somewhere between 22 and 30 years old when he died.
Okay.
And this is about 17,000 years ago. The Late Epigravettian period, specifically.
Which was after the Ice Age, right? Things were warming up.
Exactly, post-Last Glacial Maximum. So the climate's changing, especially there in northern Italy. New landscapes opening up.
And his remains, they were actually found way back in 1973.
That's right, yeah, at a site called Riparo Tagliente. It's a rock shelter up in the Lessini Mountains.
So the discovery itself wasn't new, but there was always a question mark, wasn't there?
A big one. Because the burial, well, it wasn't complete. It had been disturbed over the centuries.
Ah, so not all of him was there.
Right. They only found his lower limbs, basically.
Yeah.
Some bits of his upper body. And because it was partial and maybe no obvious, like, slam dunk evidence of how he died back then.
The cause of death was just unknown for decades.
Completely unknown, just, skeletal remains. But how he died, natural, violent, nobody knew. The story was lost.
Until recently. So what changed? What was the scientific breakthrough that finally cracked the case?
Well, this is where modern tech comes in, and it's pretty amazing. A new study went back to look at Tagliente 1's bones again.
Okay.
But they used techniques that just, well, they didn't exist in the 70s. Not like this.
What sort of techniques are we talking about?
Mostly 3D imaging and scanning electron microscopy.
SEM,
Yeah.
like a super powerful microscope.
Basically, yeah. It lets you see the surface details of the bone
Yeah.
in, like, incredible detail. Really zoom in.
And looking that closely, what did they see that everyone had missed before?
They found these specific, quite deep incisions. Marks on the surface of his left femur, the thigh bone, and also on his tibia, the lower leg bone.
Marks that weren't obvious before.
Not obvious enough to say for sure what they were. Just looking with the naked eye or older methods, you might miss them or misinterpret them.
Right, because I read that originally people thought maybe it was damage after he died, or maybe even part of some ritual like defleshing the bones.
Exactly. Those were possibilities. But this new analysis, the CM stuff, it let them see the microscopic details inside those marks.
What did those details show?
They showed the clear characteristics of projectile impact marks, PIMs.
Projectile impact marks, so not just cuts.
No, not casual cuts or ritual marks. These were from high-speed impacts, something hitting the bone hard and fast, specifically flint-tipped projectiles.
Okay, wow, so definitely weapons. And the source mentioned this is a really big deal because it's the first time they've identified this kind of violence just from the bone marks, right? Without finding the actual arrowhead stuck in there.
Yes, and that's huge for archaeology. Huge.
Why is that so significant?
Because it means we might be able to spot similar cases in other old skeletons. Ones where the weapon point didn't embed or wasn't preserved. It, expands our ability to detect this kind of thing.
Okay, let's zoom in on these injuries then. You said marks on the femur and tibia. What did they actually look like? What can they tell us about the attack itself?
So the study identified 5 separate marks, linear marks, and 4 of those 5 showed these really specific features of projectile impacts. Flint tips hitting bone.
And they weren't all in one place.
No,
Yeah.
and that's really important. There was a definite wound on the front of his thigh bone, the femur,
Okay, front of the thigh.
and another clear one on the back of his lower leg bone, the tibia.
Front and back. Okay, that immediately paints a picture, doesn't it? What does that pattern suggest?
It really does. The researchers think it points strongly towards him maybe running away when he was hit,
Oh,
or possibly being attacked from different directions at the same time, maybe surrounded.
yeah.
Getting hit from front and back is Well, it's suggestive of more than one attacker or being pursued.
And they're sure it wasn't, I don't know, an animal attack. Or butchering marks from after he died. How can they tell?
Very short. That's the power of the microscopy, the
Yeah.
They saw tiny scrapes next to the main cuts. They saw how steep and abrupt the edges of the cuts were, the sort of U-shaped profile of the grooves,
Okay.
and all those details. They just don't match animal teeth marks, which tear and gnaw, or the slicing marks from butchering tools. They match impacts, fast impacts,
Yeah.
projectiles.
Wow. And do they have any idea what kind of projectile? Like an arrow, a spear?
They do, actually,
Hmm.
based on the shape of the marks, especially the big one on the femur.
Yeah.
It looks very similar to experimental marks made using composite projectiles, the kind known from that specific period, the Late Epigravettian.
Composite, what does that mean?
It means the point wasn't just one piece of flint. It was likely made of a larger backed piece fitted together with smaller, sharp bits, maybe bitruncated points, all stuck onto a shaft.
Ah, okay. So it fits the known toolkit for that time and place?
Perfectly, yeah.
Okay, so we know he was hit by these specific weapons from different angles. Can they figure out anything more about the moment itself, like how he was standing or moving, the weapon trajectory?
They can estimate it, yeah. By looking really closely at the angle, the mark entered the bone, and how the bone itself might have chipped or fractured right at the impact point.
Okay, so what did that suggest?
Well, the one on the front of the thigh, the femur,
Mm.
that seems to have come from the front, obviously,
Yeah.
but on a downward path, hitting from slightly above, maybe.
Okay. And the one on the back of the lower leg? The tibia?
That one came from behind, but interestingly, it seems to have followed an upward trajectory, ascending.
Upward. From behind. That sounds odd if he was just standing there.
Exactly. It really argues against him just standing upright, an upward hit on the back of the lower leg. Well, it could happen if he was lying face down, maybe. But given he was hit multiple times, it's maybe more likely he was moving dynamically, perhaps, flexing his leg sharply as he ran or maybe falling forward.
Okay, that makes sense. Could these wounds have killed him?
The femur wound is definitely a candidate for the fatal blow, being right there on the front of the thigh.
Yeah.
It's very close to the femoral artery.
Yeah.
Big, major artery.
Yeah.
If that projectile cut the artery.
That would be catastrophic blood loss. Quickly fatal.
Very likely, yeah.
And we know for sure these happened right when he died, not earlier.
Absolutely certain. Zero signs of healing, none.
How can they tell?
If he lived for even a little while after getting these injuries, the bone around the impacts would show signs of starting to repair itself, remodeling. There's none of that.
Yeah.
So these are perimortem injuries. Happened right at or very, very close to the time of death.
Got it. The source also mentioned something else, some other minor bone issues he had. Nothing to do with the attack.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He had some mild periositis. It's basically a bit of inflammation on the bone surface on his femur and tibia again.
Okay.
But it's pretty common, often linked to like overuse or chronic stress from lots of activity. Totally unrelated to the weapon impacts.
So it actually fits the picture of an active hunter-gatherer.
Exactly. Fits perfectly with a mobile lifestyle, covering lots of ground.
Okay, so summing up the injuries. Violent death, hit by projectiles front and back, likely killed by the thigh wound, happened right at death. Which leads to the big question. Why? What would motivate this kind of attack 17,000 years ago?
Well, the most probable answer, looking at the archaeology and also what we know from studies of more recent hunter-gatherer groups,
Yeah.
it likely comes down to competition. Competition for resources, for territory.
And does that fit the specific time period after the Ice Age?
It fits very well. Remember, the glaciers were melting, new land was opening up, especially in mountainous areas like the Alps near where he lived.
So maybe groups were moving into these new areas.
Exactly. More movement, more contact between different groups, and potentially more friction over who gets the best hunting spots, the best flint sources, the water access, stuff like that.
And the weapons themselves, the projectiles, they hint at the type of conflict too, don't they?
They do. When you look at ethnographic studies, studies of historical or modern small-scale groups, projectile weapons like spears or darts, maybe arrows,
Yeah.
they're typically the weapons of choice for things like ambushes or raids, longer distance attacks.
As opposed to close-up fighting?
Right. They're often associated with more, let's say, strategic aggression between groups rather than, a sudden personal fight within a group.
That makes sense. But it also highlights a big challenge for researchers, right? Looking at just bones, How do you really know if it was violence between two different groups or just, say, a terrible fight within his own community? Intragroup versus intergroup.
It's a really tough distinction to make definitively, just from skeletal remains, no question.
But in Tagliente 1's case, the evidence seems to lean one way.
It does lean strongly towards intergroup conflict. Several things point that way.
Like what? What are the key indicators?
Okay, first, the projectiles themselves. As we said, they imply medium to long-range fighting. That's more typical of attacking outsiders gaining a tactical advantage. Close-up fights within a group often involve different kinds of trauma. Maybe blunt force injuries, stab wounds, often to the head or torso. We don't really see that clearer pattern here.
And the front and back hits.
That's the other big clue. Being hit by projectiles from opposing directions, it really suggests either a coordinated attack, like an ambush, or being surrounded by multiple attackers. Again, that feels more like an organized encounter between groups than a spontaneous personal brawl.
So while you can't rule out a personal motive 100%,
You can't know. A very unusual personally motivated killing is theoretically possible.
but the evidence projectiles, front-back hits, fits much better with intergroup violence, an ambush or a raid.
Exactly. That scenario seems the most compatible with all the evidence we have.
So given how incredibly rare evidence like this is from so long ago, where does Tagliente 1 really fit in the bigger story of ancient human conflict? How significant is he?
Well, you're right. A clear skeletal evidence of someone being killed violently in the Paleolithic, it's extremely rare.
And even rarer to tell if it's a group versus group.
Even harder, yeah. Distinguishing accidents or internal group violence from actual intergroup conflict or warfare, that's a major hurdle.
Are there other famous examples people discuss?
There are. You sometimes hear about Shanidar 3, the Neanderthal with a rib injury that might be from a projectile.
Might be.
Yeah, it's debated. Or Sungir 1, an early modern human possible head trauma. But again, interpretation is tricky. Was it definitely violence, intentional, an accident?
So lots of ambiguity, usually.
Often, yes. Then you have sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan. That's a cemetery with, like, dozens of individuals showing signs of violence. That looks like strong evidence for conflict. But precisely dating that site has proven challenging. So pinning down when that conflict happened is harder.
Okay, so what makes Tagliente 1 different? What makes him stand out?
Two main things. First, the clarity of the projectile evidence on the bones themselves is very strong now, thanks to the new analysis. And second, his bones have been directly dated very reliably.
Oh, the dating is key.
Absolutely. We know he lived and died somewhere around 17,000 to 15,500 years ago. That makes his skeleton one of the absolute earliest, securely dated pieces of evidence we have that points so strongly towards intergroup conflict among hunter-gatherers in the late Paleolithic.
So he provides a solid data point in time.
A really solid anchor point. And that feeds directly into this ongoing debate among researchers.
About how common violence actually was back then.
Exactly. Was it rare? Was it frequent? Some argue for mostly peaceful cooperation between these small nomadic groups. Others argue that, especially when things changed, climate shifts, population pressure, competition for new resources, like after the Ice Age conflict, was probably more common than we used to think.
And Tagliente 1 adds weight to that second argument.
It adds crucial, early, concrete data suggesting that, yes, organized violence between groups was happening, at least sometimes even that deep in the past.
Okay, so we have this grim picture of his death. Likely attacked, maybe ambushed. But that wasn't the end of his story, was it? How was he actually buried?
No. It wasn't the end. And this is another fascinating part. Despite how violently he seems to have died, he was given what looks like a formal burial by his people.
A proper burial where?
Back at the Riparo Tagliente rock shelter, in a shallow pit they dug for him.
And how was he placed? Any objects with him?
Yes, and this is really significant. He was laid on his back, arms sort of extended by his sides, and then large stones were placed specifically over his legs.
Stones over his legs? Why?
We don't know for sure, but one of those stones was really special. It had engravings on it.
Engravings? Of what?
A lion and the horn of an aurochs. That's a type of extinct wild cattle.
Wow. Engraved stone placed in the grave. And anything else?
They also found some pebbles nearby that were stained with red ochre, which is often linked to ritual.
Right.
And a pierced shell, maybe worn as decoration or an amulet.
So these sound very much like intentional grave goods, ritual items.
That's definitely the interpretation.
Yeah.
Not just random rocks, but meaningful additions to the burial. Symbolic objects.
That creates such a striking contrast, doesn't it? This brutal death, likely an attack by outsiders, followed by this careful, deliberate, maybe even honored burial by his own group.
It's incredibly poignant, yeah. How do you square those two things, the violence of the death and the seeming care or respect shown afterwards?
What do the researchers think? How do they interpret that?
Well, they wrestle with it, naturally. Was he being honored, maybe seen as a warrior who fell defending the group, or in a raid?
Or maybe the burial itself was a reaction to the trauma.
That's another strong possibility. Maybe it was less about honoring him specifically and more about the community needing to process this kind of violent, sudden death,
Hmm.
a way to sort of restore order or cope with the shock through ritual.
I think I read somewhere that sometimes in the Upper Paleolithic, burials seem extra elaborate if the person died in an unusual way, a bad death.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a theory that some of these more complex burials from this period might be specific responses to deaths that were seen as exceptional or disruptive. Things like trauma, accidents, maybe even disease. Tagliente I's death, violent, potentially at the hands of enemies, would certainly fit the bill for an exceptional event requiring a special kind of ritual response.
Wow. So, looking back on this whole deep dive,
It really is amazing applying these new technologies to bones found 50 years ago. It just opens up this incredible window 17,000 years back,
yeah.
not just into how someone died, but the whole social world around it.
And the key takeaway from Tagliente 1, it's that his bones aren't just, bones. They're actual physical evidence.
Tangible evidence, yeah. It pushes back the timeline for when we can confidently talk about organized intergroup violence among hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
It feeds vital data into that whole debate about cooperation versus conflict in our deep past.
It really makes you think about just the raw challenges people faced back then. The world changing after the Ice Age, dealing with neighbors.
Yeah, and how even that far back, these fundamental human things, community, conflict, loss, dealing with death through ritual, they leave these faint traces that we can sometimes actually read.
And maybe that final question Tagliente 1 leaves us with, lying there, wounded but buried with care, with those engraved stones.
What does that mix tell us? That blend of brutal reality and symbolic response. What does it really say about the beliefs, the social connections, the coping mechanisms of those hunter-gatherers living right on the edge of that changing post-Ice Age world?